So my part of the panel is to talk about what do we know from research about what the relationship is between the funding of the research and the actual quality of the research. I am a card-carrying dietitian, so I believe in nutrition and I believe in the profession of dietetics. And then here is my funding disclosure during the time, primarily from when I worked at the Academy, now called the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, for the funding that we received both for research and as well for the evidence analysis projects that are in the evidence analysis library. So the dialogue about industry funding and the potential for bias is hotly debated at professional societies. It's debated at research meetings like these. It's published in peer-reviewed papers. It goes over into the public media, into the regular newspapers. It also continues in LinkedIn. It continues, you'll see postings on LinkedIn about potential bias. It goes into blogs, and there's even a YouTube video on industry funding or the source of funding and the potential to impact the research. But what if research is funded by industry? Can you trust the findings? And the two kind of questions you might be asking is, are the results more favorable toward industry if it received industry funding, or is the research of high quality? And meaning, is it free from bias due to design, conduct, and analysis? So there's two different kinds of research studies that you'll find that have received a lot of publicity. One of them is looking at the direction of findings, and there are two studies I'm going to summarize today that are in the literature, looking at if it's funded by industry, are the results more likely to be favorable to industry interests? And we'll look at two of them, one by Lesser, Ebling, Ludwig in 2007, and another one more recently by Wild et al. And then the second question is, so what about the quality of the research? And I'll share with you results of a study that we did in 2011. So the first study by Lesser looked at 206 research reports that were about a specific segment of the industry, soft drinks, juice, and milk. It was published, the research studies were published between 1999 and 2003. And of those 200 studies, 111 of them declared funding, and they were classified into three different categories. Whether they received all industry funding, whether they were mixed, some industry, some non-industry funding, or whether there was no industry funding whatsoever. And then they classified the conclusions into three categories. Either the conclusions were of benefit to the industry, there was no relationship to the industry, or they were anti the industry position, what they perceived the industry position to be. And this is one of the tables from their research, and what they found was that there was an odds ratio where there was, if you had compared all industry funding to no industry funding, they were much more likely to be positive. So if you look here, you can see those results. But at the same time, they concluded then that published research was significantly related to funding source, but they stated that they were unable to collect meaningful information about factors that might reveal any specific bias, such as study quality. The second study was published in 2012, and this is by Wild et al. They looked at 79 research studies that were related to obesity that were funded either by the Dairy Checkoff or by NIH funding. And they looked at studies that received funding during the period of 2002 to 2005. There were 62 studies that were funded by the Dairy Checkoff, 16 that were funded by NIH. They classified the results into four categories. They were either favorable to industry, unfavorable, neutral, or they're undetermined. And when they evaluated it, they found that there was little evidence that the Checkoff funded research was systematically more favorable. In fact, the NIH research was more likely to be favorable to industry, but they noted that the only research that was negative was that was funded by NIH. And again, they raised questions. They said the quality of research was beyond the scope of their project, so they couldn't really comment on how well the research was done. They just looked at the findings. And then they raised questions about how funding affects the choice of research, because look at the disparity. 62 studies funded by Dairy Checkoff, only 17 funded by the NIH. So they questioned whether or not it was really the amount of research and the topics that were chosen. So from those studies, they focused on whether or not the conclusions were more favorable towards industry, and both of them acknowledged that they did not evaluate how well the research was actually done. So that means that the key question about whether or not you can believe the research, in other words, was the research flawed and reached erroneous conclusions and therefore not to believe, still is unanswered. So we looked at a second study that tried to answer that second question about whether or not the research is really flawed. And at the time we did our research, the state of the art for systematic reviews was really to look at what we call the quality of research. And there's a critical appraisal part of the systematic review where you go through and you answer questions about how well the research was done. Since that time, there's been an emphasis to move in the more state-of-the-art is to talk more specifically about risk of bias. And the Cochrane has led the effort in terms of moving away from evaluating the published research report with the longer questions and really moving to focus on risk of bias, which is supposed to answer the question, can you believe the results of the research study that's published? However, they also admit that in order to decide if you believe the research or not, you have to look at the research report. So you still kind of circle back around. You're really evaluating what's in that research report to tell you whether or not you think you can trust the results. So what we did is we looked at 2,539 research articles that had been evaluated as part of the evidence analysis library at the Academy. We looked at types of research and we classified them as either intervention, observational, or review reports. And we had already classified all these articles as either positive, neutral, or negative related to quality, not direction of findings, but how sure we were it was a solid research design. When we looked at those results, well, a little bit more about the sample. These were research reports that were related to topics of interest to dietitians. So there were 29 different topics. They were usually related to things that we were using in terms of creating evidence-based guidelines. So it's topics like adult weight managed breastfeeding, childhood overweight, hypertension, nutrition counseling, sodium, beverage or hydration, those kinds of things. There were 732 different questions that had been addressed as part of this sample. The source of funding categories we classified it either as governmental, in other words they had received government funding only, industry funding, university hospital, no funding acknowledged, nonprofit, or multiple funding sources. And then within the industry we classified food and supplement companies, pharmaceutical companies, commodity groups, other types of research fundings, and then multiple research funding. So that's how we classified the funding. And this gives you an idea of the distribution of the sample. So there was a large number of multiple funders, followed by government, university, hospital, industry, nonprofit, and then funding not reported. The way we measured quality was we looked at how the critical appraisers had reviewed the studies, and there were two different parts to that evaluation. One was that overall rating of either positive, neutral, or negative, how well the study was conducted and included in the published report. And then the second one is we looked specifically at the 10 quality criteria that were made up of that checklist for the studies that were original research. The quality criteria checklists are published on the Evidence Analysis Library. You can go look at those if you like. There are 10 major questions that are addressed with some sub-questions underneath that address what we believe was how well the study was actually conducted. And what it really looked at is how well the research design was suited to answer the question that was being proposed by the research, how well the research was done in terms of if it was blinded and randomized and you have control groups, and if it was epidemiological, did you have comparable groups between the two, and how well it was reported. Did you include all the details? Did you use the right statistical and so forth? We did not look at research publication bias. So we don't know, as Barbara mentioned, about those studies that stayed in the drawer. We don't know how much more likely there's other research out there. So we looked at the things that are inside the box, how it was designed, executed, and then reported. There was a difference between the different types of studies. So for example, when we looked at intervention and observational, we found that the percentage or the proportion receiving the green, which is the positive rating, as opposed to the neutral rating or the negative rating, were pretty much the same between intervention and observation. But when you look at the systematic reviews, they were much more likely to be negative rather than positive. Now keep in mind this study was done as of 2009, and that's when the systematic review guidelines for publications and so forth were really coming into their full implementation. So we had a number of narrative reviews that were included in our review process that were evaluated as if they should have been a systematic review. So that will influence the rating for the reviews that are included there. So did we learn the question, what do we know about what does funding matter? And we said yes, but the type of research is going to have a significant impact on that relationship. So we know that if it's a review article, it's much more likely to receive either negative or neutral ratings as opposed to positive in our sample. So back to the original question, does the source of funding matter then? And the answer kind of is yes, but not exactly in the way one might expect. The studies that did not report funding were nearly 5 times as likely to have negative ratings and 1.85 times to receive neutral ratings. And studies that reported either university or hospital funding were more likely to have neutral ratings. So when you look at the overall picture, there was no statistically significant difference between government-funded, multiple-funded, or industry-funded studies. And the two that were most similar were those that were government-funded studies or multiple funders. So if you like pictures, here's what it looks like when you look at the diagram. Government only, multiple fundings, nonprofit, industry, and the two where the differences were the university and hospital and those that did not report any funding at all. We also looked at comparison of industry segments. We looked at those that had multiple funding versus those that were funded by the food industry and those that were funded by pharmaceutical or commodities. And we did not find any statistically significant difference between those different types of industry funders. So when we looked at the individual characteristics, I wanted to kind of show you what the current state of the art is kind of looking at Cochrane's risk of bias domains. The selection bias, performance bias, detection bias, attrition bias, and reporting, and then the other biases. And if you look at the quality criteria checklist on the right, that was the tool that we have been using in the evidence analysis library. And so the items that have the check marks by, over here, if I can point the right direction, it would help. Here we go. The study groups, the selection of studies, the study groups being comparable, the description of intervention, and the outcomes. That's not showing very well. The ones with the little check marks, those are the ones that they had to be a positive rating on those in order to get an overall plus. So those are what we considered our critical, as Barbara mentioned, the fatal flaws. If you didn't have a good selection of studies, you didn't have comparable study groups, you didn't have a good description of the intervention, and you didn't have a solid description and reporting of your outcomes. Those were things that disqualified you from having a positive rating. And the ones in italics are the ones that match most closely with the Cochrane risk of bias domain, just so you can kind of see the two side by side. When we looked at those that were associated with lower ratings, in other words, they did not receive a positive ratings, the usual reasons were selection of subjects, study groups comparable, blinding, the description of the intervention, the outcomes were not fully described or fully reported, and the statistical analysis. And when we looked at the ones that received the lowest, the negative ratings, then we added the conclusion was not clearly supported by the data that was presented. So you can look at the comparison between what we were looking at and the Cochrane bias. So again, we were looking at the things that were inside this dotted box. How well the research design matched the question, how well the research was conducted, and how well the research was reported in the published literature. And the bottom line for what we looked at is there was no evidence of apparent bias due to poor research design, conduct, analysis, or reporting, which we are calling study quality, that could be attributed to industry as a funding source for the food nutrition research included in the Academy Evidence Analysis Library. However, having university or hospital funding or not having funding at all or acknowledged is clearly associated, more clearly associated with lower study quality. So the overall bottom line is the smaller research studies that focused on the direction of nutrition studies only. In other words, were the findings more favorable? They concluded that most industry-funded research had less negative conclusions. They were more likely to be positive or neutral than they were negative. But when we looked at a larger research study and looked at the actual research quality components from those studies, the quality varied more by type of research than it did by the source of fundings, and that reviews were less likely to be rated positive, and specifically narrative reviews likely caused that reason for the lower significant quality ratings. And there was no significant difference from government funding or industry funding, but what was different was whether or not there was university or hospital funding and when no funding was acknowledged at all. We did not evaluate, and keep in mind that the publishing guidelines now for reporting came out in the early 2000s, and this was completed in 2009. So we were kind of, the research community was in the middle of implementing all the reporting guidelines at that time. Consort was out, Moose, Strobe, all of those reporting guidelines, which really focused on tell us exactly how you did the research, were really kind of coming into vogue and being implemented by the journals during this time. So it's unknown if you looked at this today how well those new reporting mechanisms may have helped the reported research, and certainly when we're talking about reviews are much more likely to be held to the standards for systematic reviews than they were in the previous years. That would likely have a change if we looked at those today. I'd like to acknowledge the people who worked on the quality of research study, Scott Parrott, Deborah Cummins, Pat Splett, and our data extraction team. And with that, I'm finished.
So is it possible that the more positive results from industry is because often industry does experiments ahead of time themselves, and once they're more sure of the result, they go to academia for sort of confirmation?
I think it was outside of our scope. We can hypothesize for why that happens, and certainly, like you mentioned, industry probably has proof, or would hopefully have proof of concept before they funded larger studies. But it may also just be that they're reconfirming things that they already know that they want to use as a current finding as well. It would be nice to know, yeah. And that's in that first box about the choice of what research is funded, not how well it's done. So the question, though, is can we believe what they found?